want to start by sending a big thank you to Dr. Christopher Gaelic. Dr. Gaelic is an associate professor of public administration in the School of Public and International Affairs at NC State. And he's a member of the Energy Systems and Policy Cluster over there. Dr. Gaelic is a public policy analyst with experience working at the intersection of public policy, economics, technology, and focusing on energy and environmental governance, particularly economic policy focusing on climate and low carbon energy policy solutions. And he's a Duke alum and has a PhD also in forestry and environmental resources at NC State. So really pleased to have Dr. Gaelic with us today, and want to also give a shout out to his recent award in 2021 as recipient of the Outstanding Teacher Award at NC State. So absolutely thrilled to have you with us today, Chris. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. I appreciate it. Okay, so this is an overview slide. It's an image of the electricity supply chain that I just took off the web. I thought it was a nice image of kind of how everything lines up. The clip art you're going to see on top of it is my own. And I'm doing it simply to try to provide an overview of how the power sector interacts with the environment. And so one of the first things that was the subject of major federal legislation were the direct impacts of, say, combustion of fossil fuels. So you can get at the point of generation, you can get things like air quality impacts or water quality impacts, very, very tangible, discrete things. Hey, there's stuff coming out of that stack. Hey, there's things being put into the waterway. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. You can also have, in addition to actual pollutants, you can have temperature implications, especially if you're talking about thermal facilities, where you're actually raising the temperature of the ambient water. And so there's some things in place to look at that. If we're talking about hydro, you can also talk about the actual act of impounding and changing the run of a river and the impacts that that particular action may have. There are, of course, upstream and downstream effects if we're talking about the power sector. So actually getting the fuels to burn, so coal mining, fracking. We can talk about mining for the material components that go into things like batteries and all the upstream impacts that are there and the laws that go into affecting that particular operation. There's also downstream impacts when we're talking about waste disposal. Coal ash is something we've heard quite a lot about in the last several years, owing to some unfortunate spills that have happened both locally in the Dan River, but also regionally over in Tennessee as well. And so there's these downstream impacts of how do we dispose of things? Where does that waste go? Especially if we're talking about a transformative medium. So maybe we're cleaning up the air, but the stuff we're pulling out of the air, where does that go? Does that end up in the water? Does that get disposed of in some other way? So there's laws around that. If we start talking about some of the broader ecosystem impacts, there are implications on fish and other wildlife. For example, there can be temperature implications. If you're increasing the temperature of the water at these thermal facilities, what does that mean for wildlife? There can be direct impacts from operation of, say, wind turbines on things that may be flying about. But there's also broader impacts. If you want to put in a transmission line or a pipeline, you're going to be impacting habitat, and there are potential implications as well for species there, depending on where you're putting that in. And so you get laws like the Endangered Species Act becoming relevant for that discussion. Then there are broader implications that really start to get into some of the spatial and distributional impacts. So we have things like environmental justice, where it's not necessarily the aggregate environmental impact, but where that impact is playing out and the ability of communities affected and whether or not they're disproportionately affected to actually respond to that harm and to address that situation. There's something else that I put into the environmental side, but I think it spans quite a bit, and that's things like energy poverty and energy justice, where they have environmental components, like things like weatherization and energy efficiency, which I'd argue fall into the environmental side of things, but are broader socioeconomic policy problems that likewise play out. And this has to deal with not only just the aggregate impacts, but very much localized. So again, where are these impacts being felt? Are there certain communities that are disproportionately affected by these particular issues, and how do we start to wrap our hands around the policy solutions to address those? So of course, there's a lot of things going on here. This is a very simplified overview, anytime you're using clip art, you're not going to be promising a lot of high level discussion on the nuances. But again, the idea is to show you that it's not simply the stuff that's coming out of a stack, but rather everything from upstream to downstream, how it's managed, where it's managed, and who it affects are all components of the environmental policy discussion, and that's only on the power sector, right? And so you can start to look at some of these major environmental policies that come to play in this space. So at the federal level, you have the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. In the Clean Air Act, you have things like NAAQS, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. You have your cross-state air pollution rule that affects pollution that may cross state borders. You have your mercury and air toxic standards. We'll talk a little bit about that. You have some dueling climate proposals under the Obama and Trump administrations, respectively, the Clean Power Plan and the Affordable Clean Energy Plan, that are attempting to use the Clean Air Act to address greenhouse gas emission concerns. You have the Clean Water Act. You have NPDES, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. That's why we say NPDES and not National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, and the effluent limitation guidelines, as well as cooling water intake standards under that. You have CCRs, also known as coal combustion residuals or coal ash, that again is regulated under federal and state law. You have RCRA, the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. This governs how you dispose of hazardous and non-hazardous waste, as well as the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA. That's just a sample of policies at the federal level. You also have several going on, not only within North Carolina, but at the state level generally. You have, in North Carolina specifically, the Clean Smokestacks Act. You have the Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Portfolio Standard that governs renewable energy generation here in the state. You have the Coal Ash Management Act, recently passed and amended a few times over the last few years, as well as the Clean Energy Plan being developed using existing authorities under an executive order under the Cooper administration here in the state. And so I want to go into a few of these just as an example of the way that these discussions tend to play out and how these tools tend to operate. So for example, in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, these are examples of what we call cooperative federalism. Both laws in their current iteration, date from the 1970s. There have been some minor updates here and there, particularly in 1990 for the Clean Air Act, but by and large, they're kind of in a similar form as they have been over this last several decades. And the idea behind this cooperative federalist framework is that you have these national targets that are set, but then a lot of flexibility is afforded to the states and how they meet those, what they do to actually achieve those targets. So again, national target set, but then flexibility on how do we get that. In some cases, particularly on the water side, sometimes you may have delegation of the entire program operation to a given state. Okay, so, but again, the idea is the federal kind of takes the lead in setting the target, and then the states work to figure out how to get there. So in the case of NAAQS, and when you hear NAAQS, it's the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. There's a number of criteria pollutants that have a certain criteria that are set at. And as you can see here, there are different standards. There's a human health standard as well as an environmental health standard for some of these. And you can have just the way that it's met. So it's not always instantaneous one point in time, but you may have an average level in order to be in compliance with this. If you're not in compliance, if you're in what we call non-attainment, that's where some of these federalist kind of interactions come into play. Because again, it's kind of looking at ambient conditions. So it's not really paying attention to the individual sources of pollution for the federal part. It's just looking at what's the ambient standard. But if you're not in attainment, that's when it kicks over to the state side of things, where you start to do your implementation plan to get back. And so here are some counties that have been designated for different non-attainment for different NAAQS. So you can see that kind of regionally plays out in California and other places in the West. You can see some clustering around major metropolitan areas as well. But again, it's looking at the ambient air quality and then putting it back on the states and particularly some of these counties within the states to say, how are we going to get back? So if we're not there, what are we going to do to make sure that we can start to hit these targets? You can contrast this with the mercury and air toxic standards, or MATS, which operate at the unit level. So this isn't really paying attention to the ambient air quality, but actually looking, what is each individual unit doing and how do we regulate that? So this particular one pertains to facilities over 25 megawatts in size. And the way it's set is that it uses a technology standard, in this case called Maximum Achievable Control Technology, or MACT. A lot of spoken acronyms in the environmental policy space: NACS, MAT, NIPDES, MACT. That's one of the things that I teach in my course, is kind of an overview of the spoken acronyms, because it's really important in this debate when you get rapid conversations around these things. These concepts are thrown out really quickly, and so to be able to be conversant is an important part. But you have MACT here, and that's set at looking the best performers in the sector, and using that to establish the level of performance. But then it goes back to the units to say, okay, this is where you have to perform to. This is what you have to meet. And again, contrast that with the ambient air quality standards, where they're looking at ambient air quality all over the place. And then if you're not in attainment, you kick it back to figure out how you're going to get back into attainment, versus this, where you're focusing on individual unit emissions and saying, this is what you have to perform, paying less attention to the ambient impact of that. Of course, that's important, but you're focusing on the unit level contributions to the larger concentration of these particular gases in the environment. And when you look at how these particular facilities break down, and this is 10 years old now, and there've been a lot of changes in the power sector, but I think this map kind of shows a difference in how you get some of the non-attainment areas and NACs, which tend to be clustered around major metropolitan areas and out west, versus the MATS facilities that are going to be impacted by this particular rule. You see very different layout. You see a lot more in the east and the Midwest. You see a lot of clustering around the Ohio River, for example, and we'll talk briefly about why there's that clustering. But you can see, again, the Clean Air Act, under which both of these are operates in kind of different ways, and how it actually implements from unit standard stuff to ambient conditions. So it just gives you an overview of some of the different tools and approaches that are used at the federal level to regulate, in this case, simply air pollution emissions. So we have the acid rating program, and the reason that I bring this up is established under the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. It used for its time a novel approach to regulate largely sulfur dioxide emissions in a flexible, cost-effective manner. And the idea was that you had downwind forests and ecosystems being affected by upwind production of sulfur-producing largely coal-fired power plants. And the idea was that if we can set a cap on the total emissions and then allow those capped facilities to figure out, do I want to reduce myself, or do I want to buy the right to pollute from someone else? You provided this mechanism for the sector itself to figure out the most cost-effective manner to get those emissions down. And again, this was kind of a kind of novel for its time, but since this idea of a cap and trade has been adopted by the European Emissions Trading Scheme, it was the underpinning of some of the climate legislation that came out about a decade ago at the federal level. And this idea of a cap and trade is really caught on, is a much more efficient way to reduce emissions. And what you can see here is that on the ground, quite effective in reducing sulfur deposition. Again, largely a Midwest, Northeast thing, where pollution's emitted in the Midwest and then carried downwind into some of those other states, but also very effective in terms of cost. So it was able to achieve those goals at a much lower cost because of the flexibility provided by, I'm not telling every facility what to do, I'm letting them choose. And so those that could reduce emissions did so. Those that could not purchased allowances off the market, and allowed the whole sector to bring down emissions at the most cost-effective manner. At the state level, we have a number of RPS, renewable portfolio standards, and clean energy standards. Most states have them, not all. North Carolina has one in place. They vary tremendously. They vary in terms of targets. They vary in terms of, some of them have carve-outs. In North Carolina, for example, there's carve-outs for solar, poultry litter, and swine waste. And so some states are using those as ways to encourage particular industries, to try to encourage increased penetration of particular technologies. But they're far and wide in terms of what they require, when they require it to be met, and so on. This is going to come up again in some research that I'm going to just mention at the very end of this, depending on how much time we have. But again, these are state level policies. This is not federal, this is state level, and so adopted on a state by state basis. On the water side, we have a few that I'm going to mention. We have the cooling water intake standards under the Clean Water Act. Again, NIPDs comes into play here. And those are in place to prevent the impingement and entrainment of fish, so fish getting pinned against a screen or actually drawn into the facility itself. And it's both physical in terms of obstructions, but also operational. How are you actually drawing in the water? You have the Coal Ash Management Act here in the state, again, passed in 2014 and amended a few times since, that's paying attention to how coal ash is actually disposed of, as well as increasing the monitoring of water quality in areas where you have had disposal in the past. But of course, it's not that easy. To simply say like water's regulated here and air is regulated there and species are over here. There's these impacts. There's the energy water nexus, where if you start doing things like increasing production of biofuels, you may have an increased impact on water withdrawal for the production of the corn for that. You may have, depending on the technology you're putting in, increased water withdrawals. For example, some of the carbon capture technology uses more water than a standard facility without that. And so you may have increased water coming from that. Switching to solar or wind might reduce your water load quite substantially. Hydro facilities likewise have a great deal of impact on water. Obviously, it's in the name, right? And so there's ways that you can start to, if you reduce this or if you shift to that, you may also have impacts on this over here. And this becomes really important when we start thinking about future climate conditions and maybe water stress, either flood or drought conditions that may influence how some of the power sector is operating depending on where you are. And as I mentioned at the front end, there's also the question of who's affected and where they're affected. Are there certain communities that are disproportionately affected? So are there poor communities, communities of color that are disproportionately affected by some of these impacts? So you may have an aggregate impact that is improving, but who is impacted under that improving trajectory may be disproportionately affected. And they may likewise have a lack of agency to address that situation, either through the public policy process or through the ability to, if they so choose, to move from that particular place. And so this is where environmental justice really comes into play. And something efficient like the cap and trade program that I mentioned can actually exacerbate that, because you may be in providing for an efficient way for everybody to bring it down, creating hotspots where those that are still operating may be operating in poorer communities. Those are the ones that are maybe less cost effective to reduce. And so they simply buy off the market to keep polluting at a certain level, and they may continue to disproportionately affect certain communities. And so you start to see these concerns come up that even you may be able to get to a improved aggregate level at an efficient way, those that are still impacted may be disproportionately so. And so you really need to start paying attention to not only this aggregate impact, but also, again, over time and over space, who is impacted and how are they impacted, and are there things you can do to ameliorate those impacts? Okay, so moving to an example of some research, I wanted to stop there on kind of my overview, because I wanted to, instead of just saying like, hey, here's all this stuff, it's really complex, here's some clip art, etc. I wanted to show kind of what does research in this space look like, and what are some of the data that we use to do this stuff. Again, as I mentioned at the outset, a lot of the work I do is very applied. There's not a lot of fancy stuff that goes into the work itself, not a lot of computational magic. But there's a lot of time spent on the craft of the research question and on the assembly of data sets, because some of the applied stuff gets really messy, especially if it's very time sensitive, or we're trying to do something that's emerging. Sometimes the data aren't there yet. If it's a new question, if it's a new issue, we don't necessarily have the data to look back on. And so it's oftentimes trying to find proxies and say, how do we actually get to this thing we want to measure that people haven't measured yet, because it hasn't really been seen as an issue yet. It can be somewhat challenging. So I think this is a good example of a relatively straightforward question that had 80-90% of the work in sleuthing to find the data and to put it together in a robust, rigorous way. One of the things that I also do, in addition to the policy stuff, is kind of on the voluntary side. So the behavioral, the norming side of things, the voluntary stuff, right? So if we're talking institutions, there's the formal stuff of you have to do this, otherwise you're fined, whatever. But there's also the informal, the sort of the nudges, the sort of this is just what we do. And so this idea of voluntary governance is really interesting to me in the climate space. And so we see starting in about 2018, a number of utilities, major utilities, saying that we're going to reduce our own emissions. And these are the targets we're going to set for ourselves. Duke set theirs up in late 2019. It's a net zero pledge. So they're not exactly pledging to get to zero themselves. So they're not going completely emissions free, but through use of things like carbon offsets, through purchase of carbon stored in other mechanisms or other reductions, trying to bring their net impact down to zero. And there's been a lot of research in the last year or two on how individual utilities are doing in meeting these pledges, looking at things like the integrated resource plans, or IRP. These are sort of the roadmaps that utilities set up to say, this is what we're going to be doing over the next few years and why. It varies from state to state on the role that particular process plays. I'm not going to get into that. That's a whole other series of lectures there. But there's been a lot of research focused on individual implementation, is the point there. What there's been less of is this, so what does it mean in aggregate? So if you add up all of these pledges and you go back to some of those state and federal policies that I mentioned and assume that some of those reductions might have been encouraged under state renewable energy policy or clean energy policy, or there might be other reasons why they're reducing. What's the net impact of those pledges, right? Because if I'm in a state where I'm required to produce 100% or 50% or whatever percent of my power through clean or renewable mechanisms, I'm already going to be reducing my emissions to comply with that. If I then say I'm going to reduce my emissions by 80% as part of a voluntary pledge, my net impact of that pledge is the difference between that. Is the difference between my pledge and what I would have had to have done under the state policy that's already there. And there's been less of that done. And we think that's important because as we're starting to think about through the Biden administration and look at some of the goals under the Paris Agreement, we need to understand where we are right now before we start to figure out where we need to go, particularly if there are some trade-offs we can make. If the utility sector is doing okay, relatively speaking, maybe we can focus some of our efforts on the harder to reduce sectors like transportation or industry. And so getting a baseline of what we can expect under existing state and maybe even federal regulations relative to what these utilities are themselves pledging is an important first step. Every pledge is different. Some of these utilities are including their auto fleet, for example. Others are marking their pledges not as an absolute, but as an emissions intensity. So maybe they're growing and they're going to be emitting more, but each megawatt hour has less carbon dioxide equivalent associated with it. So how do we start to make these comparable? How do we start to do apples to apples? And that's even after we get to the fact that we're dealing with different reductions, different targets, different target years, different baseline years. So a lot of these assume 2018 because the year they were making the call, but several others went back as far as 1990 or the early 2000s to say we're measuring against that. And so trying to figure out how to make these apples to apples was very challenging. On top of that, trying to figure out how to get all the data itself was incredibly challenging. If you look at the notes and emission data sources, there's very few commonalities across these. US EPA 2020 is the eGrid data set. I'm going to talk about that briefly. NJ Bradley and Associates is a benchmarking study that's done regularly that compiles existing data. Everything else is individual utility specific. It's the utilities pledging. It's sometimes in a fact sheet. Sometimes it's a corporate sustainability report that's hundreds of pages long that you have to go fishing for. Other times they're referring to other disclosure efforts that they're doing under the Carbon Disclosure Project or elsewhere, and they look to those forms. And so trying to come up with this data is incredibly, incredibly difficult and time consuming. Again, about 80–90% of our work was simply trying to put all of these things into one place. So in this case, it wasn't necessarily the analytics that was the complicated part. Again, that was really straightforward. It's a spreadsheet we included in his supplemental data, right? It's just like check my formulas. Like that's pretty straightforward stuff. It's this times that minus this over here. The challenging part is getting the data in a rigorous, robust, and transparent way so that it's replicable, so that people trust what we found and can say, like, yeah, I see that, but also part of our finding is this is a mess. And so if you're going to be counting on utility pledges, voluntary governance as a means to achieve climate governance outcomes, you need to provide a way that people can actually follow up that doesn't require hours upon hours and student assistance and oversight of faculty mentors to actually pull it together in a way that after 10 months and peer review is still kind of being batted around. That's it. Some of the resources that we did use. The EIA has some really cool data that they report. They actually report the form data from a couple different surveys they do that are available at the plant level and the generator level. The 923 and the 860, you can get these, download these. It's all sorts of fun stuff to play with. There's power sector emissions data available from the EPA. This looks at emissions data, very fine grain in some cases, that you can start to look at individual emissions data to start to aggregate some of these things up. Since we're talking about different programs, different collectors, different agencies, I like to use eGrid, which is compiled of a lot of different sources. This is just, I mean, it's a lot of fun just to play around with this stuff, because you can go down to what are the names of the facilities, who owns them, where are they located, what are they producing, what fuel are they using, when did they come into operation, et cetera, et cetera. Several tabs. There's an online explorer you can use. I download the raw data and just play with that. And that was one of the data sets that we used pretty consistently across our research. And as I mentioned, because we're talking about voluntary governance, there's third parties that collect this. There's the Carbon Disclosure Project that records a lot of these, not only utility, but other private sector pledges and reporting that they do on their climate and sustainability efforts. And so those are some other data sets that we use for this. And again, the exercise isn't so much in the analytics and the complexity of that, but it's just trying to take all of this data, all these data that are located in different buckets, and somehow put them together and make them play together in a way that is replicable and transparent. And that's the reason I mentioned this here, is that this is where you really need to be creative in your sleuthing. And it requires some just very clear-headed thinking on what am I trying to achieve? What are the assumptions I'm going to have to make? And how am I going to get there with what I have, especially given the fact that this conversation is evolving so quickly. I don't have time to create a new data set from scratch. So how do I take what's out there and put it together?